Hey guys, and welcome back to Unit 4 of our American Lit class. This unit lecture is going to be a little bit shorter because we are still in the postmodern period. So we're not talking about a new literary period. Instead, we're talking about the two authors that you read for this unit, Sylvia Plath and Toni Morrison. And then, of course, we'll look at the other assignments that you have for Unit 4. So we're going to start with Sylvia Plath. So Plath was born in 1932. Her father immigrated to the United States. He was a German-Polish university professor. Her mother introduced her to poetry at a young age. So she grew up in a very academically minded household. At a really young age, she absolutely idolized her father and really wanted to please him, but we can see that she does sort of have some disillusionment about her father later on in life. She lost her dad when she was about 8. He died from complications of diabetes. He had a leg wound that he refused treatment for, and so he ended up getting gangrene and dying because of complications with that. Plath also publishes her first poem that same year, which is fascinating. So when she was finished with high school, she won a scholarship to Smith College, and there she won another competition to be a guest editor at Mademoiselle magazine. A lot of the things that happened to her there are related in her semi-autobiographical novel, The Bell Jar. And we learned that Plath really suffered from depression, as well as some other mental health issues during this time in her life. When she was a young woman, late teens, early 20s, she had her first suicide attempt. She took a bunch of pills, and she actually received electroshock therapy to help treat her depression. Her depression was not cured by this treatment. But she does seem to recover somewhat. She attended a summer writing program at Harvard University in 1955, and it wasn't long after that she won a Fulbright scholarship to move to London and pursue her education further. So while she's in London, she meets a fellow poet, Ted Hughes, and they begin a very interesting, complicated relationship. According to her journal, the first time they met, he tried to kiss her and she bit him, drawing blood. So, needless to say, it wasn't necessarily love at first sight, but they did have a very intense love affair. They loved passionately and they fought passionately. After a lot of persuasion, Ted Hughes did convince Plath to marry him. She was very hesitant about this. She wasn't sure that she wanted to get married, and she really wasn't sure that she wanted to have children. But in 1960, Plath gave birth to the first of her 2 children. She has this poem called Metaphors about her pregnancy. Um, it, it is enlightening about questions that she experienced while she was pregnant. In June of 62, Plath has her second suicide attempt. She drove her car off the road. It was a very tumultuous time in her life, and it was around that same time that she found out that Ted Hughes, who had convinced her that marrying him would be the best decision she ever made, she finds out that he's having an affair. So this was definitely a rough spot for Plath. She spends the next few months writing and publishing at just a furious pace. This is when she writes her collection of poetry named Ariel, which is, one of her best collections. But despite the fact that she was working prolifically during this time, she is described as depressed, isolated, and mentally unstable by those who knew her. People were very concerned about her, especially since she was now estranged from Hughes and taking care of their children on her own. The National Health Institute in London actually sent a day nurse to go every day to help Plath take care of her children. In February of 1963, Plath sealed her children in a room for their own safety, turned the gas on the stove, placed her head in the oven, and died from asphyxiation. So she was only 30 years old when she committed suicide. So there's some questions that a lot of critics ask surrounding Plath's work. One of them, this is the third one on the list, was she a great poet, or were people simply fascinated by her because of her tragic life? And I think that the answer is definitely both of those things. She is an amazing poet. Her work is insightful and intuitive and beautifully written, but also she does have this terribly tragic life. And, the second point on the slide, how much of the author's biography should be considered when interpreting their work? Plath is definitely a confessional poet. She reveals what's in her soul and shares it to the world. And so much of her work is a part of who she is. So where do you draw the line between, human being that exists outside of their work and the person they appear to be within their work? It's also interesting to ask, like, how was her poetry affected by her relationship with Ted Hughes? And then also, to what extent does her work, fit into categories or genres such as confessional poet or feminist poet? And can she be those in some of her works and not in others? So one of the poems that I had you look at this week is her poem, Daddy. And this is just a fascinating poem to see like what she's experiencing and what she's feeling. She definitely sees herself as helpless, but she's angry about it. She refers to herself as a foot entrapped in a shoe, as a Jew in a concentration camp. And this is because of her father's tyranny and later her husband's tyranny. And in a lot of ways, she blames her relationship with Ted Hughes on her father. And she sees her marriage to Ted as a reaction to the trauma that she suffered from her father's disposition. So it's just interesting to see how those two are connected. Most critics agree that this poem is probably mostly autobiographical, though we do see her use figures of speech that are wildly exaggerated. Her father was not a Nazi. He was not a sadist. He was obviously not a vampire or the devil. So she uses like these real things, a Nazi and a sadist, along with these sort of fictional or supernatural things, a vampire and a devil. And she attributes all of this to her father. And perhaps even towards patriarchy in general. Now, one of the most fascinating things about this work is her use of verbal irony in the title. So we would expect daddy, or that word, to be used in terms of a parent-child relationship with like a young child who looks up to their father. And that's definitely not what we have in this poem. And so maybe Plath is suggesting that is the relationship that she was missing, or the relationship that she would have liked to have. Whatever her meaning or use of the word is, it's important to note that, this is a poem. It's a piece of art that is a reflection of her feelings, and it has resonated with a lot of people because she is an wonderful poet. So the next author that we are going to look at today is Toni Morrison. Excuse me. So her name is Chloe Anthony Wolford, or that's how she was born. We get the Toni from the Anthony. So she has an interesting upbringing. She lived in an integrated neighborhood where there were both black and white people. She talked about being the only black kid in her kindergarten class, but also the only child in her kindergarten class that could read. And so she didn't see a lot of the racial tension that was going on in the United States until her teen years. She graduated with honors from high school and then went to Howard University where she studied literature and classics. Then she went on to Cornell University before beginning her teaching career at Texas State University. So in 1957, Morrison returned to Howard University to teach, and that's where she met her husband, Harold Morrison. They married and had their first child in 1961. So this is when Morrison actually joined a writing group and published her first novel. In 1964, her husband decided to return to Jamaica, where he was from, but Morrison remained in the United States with her two sons, and this is when their marriage dissolved. During her lifetime, she wrote so many novels and poems. She wrote 2 plays. She wrote several children's books with her son Slade, and then she wrote 2 pieces of short fiction. One of them is the short story that we looked at this week. And here's just some pictures of her later in life. Okay, so let's talk about RECITATIF. This is her sole published short story. And what a RECITATIF is a vocal style in which text is spoken in the rhythm of natural speech, but with slight melodic variation. It's a part of an opera. This is Twyla's story. And basically, this story is a story of doubles. We have one black girl and one white girl. But Morrison intentionally writes the story in a way that we don't know which one is which. So both of these girls are misfits in the orphanage. So first of all, they're in an orphanage, but they're not orphans. Both of them have mothers that are alive. Twyla's mother dances late, so whatever that means. And then Roberta's mother is sick. They're also both bad students. Roberta cannot read, and Twyla can't remember things. So it's just kind of interesting to see how these girls are very similar, even though they also have some differences. And then there's also just quite a bit of racial ambiguity in the story. So Roberta is a girl from a whole other race, but since we don't know what race Twyla is, we don't know what race Roberta is. They are referred to being like salt and pepper. So we know that one of them is white and one of them is black. In the story, they say, everything is so easy for them. They think they own the world, but we don't know who them is, which ethnicity. And Morrison is constantly giving us clues and then undermining those same clues. And she's really doing this to make the point that you can't take stereotypes and assume a person's race based off of those stereotypes. Excuse me. That really plays into some themes in this work, ideas of race and racism, and does morality have anything to do with race? We see, even though one of these girls is white and one of these girls is black, they both have the complete moral failure when they refuse to step in and help Maggie. So, we're spending the first part of this story trying to figure out, which girl is white and which girl is black and why does it matter? And then Morrison kind of pulls the rug out from under us and teaches us that it doesn't really matter which girl is black and which girl is white because they both have the same moral failing. And there's this loss of innocence in the story, questions about Maggie and memory and how we remember things and how that affects the way we live our life. And then ultimately, this question of like, what are people capable of? I really hope that you enjoyed this story and you were able to get a lot out of it. Morrison is she's an amazing author. Her book, The Bluest Eye, has won quite a few awards. And her work, Beloved, despite being very difficult to read because of the subject matter, is just such an amazing piece of literature. And she um, captures a time and a place and an experience that only those who have recently come out of slavery could feel. And she translates that into this wonderful work of fiction for her readers. If you haven't read any of her other stuff, I highly suggest that you read it. She is just such an amazing author. So for Unit 4, you have your reading journal and you have your discussion board and replies. And I also wanted to remind you that you will be writing a review of the novel that you selected in Unit 7. So do not forget about it. Do not leave it to the last minute. Be working on reading that novel as you go throughout the course. As always, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, anything like that, please reach out. You can visit me during my office hours. We can make an appointment if those times don't work for you, or I am always happy to answer emails or set up Zoom meetings. You guys have a great day, and I will see you in Unit 5.